okay, so we've taken back a lot of the stuff with government. We've taken back all of those things. Do you think that's actually possible? Like, is the government too big at this point, and are people too dumbed down to understand why big government isn't important? So, for example, when I hear a lot of progressives saying, that it's just the government should redistribute and all of these government programs, and they get upset when we cut money to the arts, I don't think that's going to stop art. I think it actually might help art. But we've just become so numb to how things work that if you were to try to reverse some of this stuff, you might do some really irreparable damage in ways that maybe we can't even see.
Well, at the risk of sounding like a founding father, I'm going to quote TJ and say...
I should have brought the wigs.
Yeah,
we should have been doing this in powdered wigs.
The natural tendency is for government to grow and liberty to shrink. So do I think we can go back? I think we can. The only problem is that we have to adopt not the principles, but the tactics of some of our opponents, right? The Fabian socialists who want to try and grow government bit by bit, is we're going to have to try and fight a game of inches, right? And we're going to have to take ground bit by bit. So I do think that we can go back, but the problem is that with my movement, the Liberty Movement, is that we're not content with small gains, right? We want to see big gains. We want to start seeing major victories because we see our opponents getting major victories all the time. And I think we've got to be a little bit more patient. We've got to fight, on the short game before we can worry about the long game in some ways.
Why doesn't the party do anything down ticket? Why is it that you only hear about libertarians come national election time? And as far as I know, are there any? There must be some randomly avowed libertarians in Congress.
They're there. It's just that we sort of, there's not a lot of incentives because when you run as a senator or for president as a libertarian, you're going to get the same amount of hell that you're going to get if you run for a lower office. But at least there's the benefit of getting a little bit of notoriety, right? A little bit of fame, perhaps, a little bit of opportunity to advance your ideas. I mean, when you're running for the dog catcher as a libertarian, you're going to get the same amount of hell, but it's your neighbor next door that's going to give it to you. So I think that the incentives are probably messed up there, and also we just I think that just a lot of people don't know what it means to be a libertarian. A lot of people who will, Bill Maher says he's a libertarian, right? And what's the guy John Bolton, Ambassador John Bolton, came on my show once and was like, I'm a libertarian.
Really?
Invade Russia. Like, okay.
Right, because I think of him more as a neocon.
Right. Well, to some neocons, and this is going to make more people angry, but to some neocons, they actually consider themselves anarchists in a sense, no borders, right? And that if we see somebody, if we see somebody like a genocide going on overseas and things like that, well, if we believe in a borderless world and these are all humans, members of the human race, why should we not intervene overseas? I mean, a lot of Democrats agree with that. Right, that we should be stepping into Darfur and Sudan and Yemen, and we should be, having humanitarian interventions around the world. And so the neoconservatives, in some ways, think of themselves as libertarian humanitarians in some way, because by bringing democracy to the Middle East, they are spreading freedom around the world, and that's their thought. The only problem is that in using government for this, their ends may be positive, but the means that they use end up, with the destruction of regimes and with humanitarian crises. Right.
So what would your position be on that then? I know that obviously you wouldn't be for nation building, but in a case of a true genocide or a case of what's happening in Syria now, I think the general libertarian idea is thought of as isolationist. Where do you fall on that?
In some sense, some libertarians are isolationists. Actually, many of that's more of a paleoconservative thing. The people who want to build a wall on the southern border, right, and they want to stop trade overseas. Those people are much more isolationist. But there are ways to solve these problems, and if you're going to use government to solve foreign policy problems, you should use the Constitution. That's really what it is. And the problem is that we ignore the Constitution. The Constitution actually gives, and libertarians don't talk this up enough, the Constitution does give the Congress some authorization to act in a manner that would make liberals very angry, which is that it would allow the Congress to lay a letter of marque and reprisal. The last time they did that was the War of 1812, so international laws and norms have changed. So if it's a terrorist activity essentially would be something similar to how we dealt with Osama bin Laden. But because we have such a deep and profound sense of patriotism in the United States, we think only the government can kill terrorists. We're not willing to go all 1776 on their butts and hire a merc, which is really what we're talking about here.
So in a case like that, like a bin Laden type case, you would actually be for that. You're basically subcontracting our army out, and it's probably, you would argue, I assume, it would be a cheaper and more effective way of doing this.
Ron Paul, after 9/11, actually introduced legislation to go and to kill bin Laden using letters of marque and reprisal, because at least we're following constitutional due processes. Now, a lot of libertarians that don't agree with the authorization for the use of military force have to admit that that was, quote unquote, a congressional authorization. And the real problem that we're dealing with in terms of law and the laws of war are that if we declare war on ISIS, in some sense, if we lose, we're legitimizing them as a state actor. And in some ways, we don't want to do that. So in order for us to behave in a manner that is in conduct with constitutional principles, reviving Article 1, Section 8 and the letters of marque is a way for us to follow constitutional processes. But the problem is that liberals aren't going to like this because we're talking about privatizing the military, and the conservatives aren't going to like it because it's not the whole badass Team America, hell yeah, SEAL Team 6, kill them.
Right.
But we've got thousands of former veterans who are out of work, who would love to do the United States a favor. And if you gave them a contract, one of the beautiful things about it is, and only libertarians are going to like this, is that any bounty that they capture over there can be brought back and sold to the United States. So all those guns that fell into the hands of ISIS can come back and be sold, not in California, but in Missouri, where I'm from, you could have a beautiful new, military grade weapon.
So when I hear you talk about this stuff, I can go there intellectually with you for sure. And I like the ideas of this, and especially if you root things in the Constitution, I love that. When I hear you say this, though, there's a piece of me going, this sounds like Rambo, or it just sounds like some 80s movie that Schwarzenegger or Stallone were in, where they got a bunch of mercenaries. I'm pretty sure this was a movie. Was this partly The Rock? I think. They get a bunch of disgruntled former military men. They come together. They find the guy. I think Predator was sort of about this too. There's an alien that you're going to hunt, right? Like something. But the idea of that just sounds crazy to people. I'm not saying to you it's crazy, but so how do you even get there then?
Well, new ideas they always sound crazy, right? Like legalizing marijuana 30, 40 years ago, you're crazy, you're stupid, you're a stoner, blah, 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 and now we see that things start to change, right? And, crazy people, like, the problem with this is that there's this really great quote where somebody used the other day on Twitter. They said that smart people sound like crazy people to stupid people. So the problem may not be that just because an opinion is in the minority doesn't mean it's wrong, right? Most of the time, whenever people are like, "Oh, your idea is crazy," nobody agrees with you. Well, maybe most people are kind of stupid. Right? So maybe you're the crazy ones.
And the media is not helping that situation at all.
At some point, you've got to be willing to put your foot in the ground and take a stand and say, "I don't care if nobody agrees with me. I'm going to take a stand on principle." And listen, the Founding Fathers did not put this into the Constitution for no reason. You know why they did this? It's because the War of 1776 was primarily won on the seas by private mariners. There was no continental navy. There was something like maybe 6 or 7 ships. There were over 1,000 people who turned their merchant mariner ships into dogs of war. I mean, this is the days of fighting sail, but I mean, without those merchant mariners turned privateers, we would not have won our War of Independence. They captured hundreds of British ships. So I mean, when the going gets tough, sometimes you have to turn to the private market to solve these things. But again, the reason why it's distasteful to the establishment is for 2 different reasons. The conservatives love it. They're like, "Oh, this is a great idea, but we'll never get the liberals on board, and we'd much rather trust it to our Navy SEAL team guys." And the liberals are like, "Oh my God, you're privatizing war. I mean, it's horrible. It's the free market and it's war." So it's very hard to win that battle. But I mean, whatever I do, I try and couch it in actual precedent, law, the law, the Constitution. That way I think you remain consistent. And again, new ideas always sound crazy until they finally become accepted.
Yeah, so speaking of precedent and the Constitution, what do you think of the general state of the Constitution right now? I think it's a pretty beautiful, almost perfect document to be governed by. but it doesn't seem to be what we're really governed by anymore. It's being trampled in every direction right now.
Yeah.
You can make cases that Trump's trampling it in certain ways with executive actions, and by the way, Obama did plenty of them, and George W. Bush did plenty of them, so that's a nonpartisan attack. We also don't, we do military actions where we don't get congressional authorization. What was Libya? What do they call it? A kinetic military action or something? They just make up terms, and you go, oh, that's not a war. I'm pretty sure if Libya had been blowing us apart, we'd call it a war. So the general state of how we are or are not governed by the Constitution.
In many ways, I think we're living in a post-constitutional republic. It has some of the trappings of a constitutional republic, and the good thing is that the Bill of Rights still exists. It's still in force. I mean, Congress uses the Fifth Amendment all the time. They've got people in there in the hearings that are always having to plead the Fifth.
Yeah, that's a big one for these guys.
Right, and then they, of course, the Supreme Court relies on the Second Amendment when it upholds decisions in like Heller or McDonald versus Chicago. So you've got the Second Amendment. I don't think anybody would, well, maybe some people would like to get rid of it, but I think,
there's plenty of people that would, sure.
But most people, I think, cooler heads will prevail on that issue. You've got the First Amendment, which is in retreat in a lot of ways. College campuses probably primarily the spots where they're in retreat. It's also in retreat in some ways in the mainstream media. This is why, the Rubin Report is probably so popular and successful, not just because you're so tremendously talented, but because people are seeking out alternate means of information. We don't live in North Korea, so I can't say that the Constitution has been a total failure, but I do think that in some ways the Constitution was far from perfect. The founders tried to get rid of slavery at the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It didn't happen. It took another 100 years and a bloody civil war. So there were some institutional problems with the Constitution, and we had to pass a 13th and a 14th Amendment, and again it took a war for that. But I think that if you look at post-war amendments, of course you've got things like. You've got the 16th and the 17th Amendments, which have been, the most anti-libertarian parts of the Constitution. Now we have a law by bureaucracy, right? So in many times, like things like the FDA or the EPA, they'll write law and enforce it. And that was definitely alien to the concept of constitutional laws written by the founders. So if you're going to have a bureaucracy, then I think the bureaucracy should be limited to operating within constitutional law. But if they're going to create laws, then those laws should have to be passed by Congress, and those laws are regulations in many ways. So that's really where the problem comes, is with all the executive branch agencies that have been created that I think are probably the biggest problem that we have. Yeah.
For the record, I didn't mean that in and of itself it's perfect, but in terms of the way that we can be governed as we humans are the ones that write this. I mean, it's pretty close.
It's the best we've got.
Because we've got us in it, and we are flawed things that create these things. So as perfect as maybe we can create, but of course, just as an independent thing.
Probably the biggest thing, though, is that for some reason the founders didn't build a wall along the southern border. So that can be improved upon.
Well, because at the time there would have been no need for a casino
down
there.
That's a joke, by the way.
But wait, all right. So you mentioned the EPA. So the two ones that I hear all the time, or the Food and Drug Administration. These are the two that you hear.
Right.
When people say libertarians are nuts. Even Bill Maher, who I know he half now identifies as a libertarian, but he's for a lot of big government stuff at the same time. I saw a couple weeks ago he said something about that Trump, got rid of this thing with the EPA, and now they're going to start dumping in rivers again, is immediately what he said. And to me, it's like we now live in 2017 where everyone has a phone, and if the company a block away from you is dumping in the river, or the smoke's coming out of their chimney, or that everyone would report on everyone. That's another problem that society has altogether.
Right.
But that we would police ourselves in a way, and as John Stossel, who I love, would always say, the more regulations we keep putting in, companies just figure out other ways to do it. We just keep putting money in lawyers' pockets, and we're not actually accomplishing anything. We're just shifting around bullshit, basically, all over the place. So I assume
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so two things. There's the EPA and then there's the FDA. So very briefly with the EPA. The EPA was created by Nixon. It was created to essentially offer scientific information in court cases where property rights were in dispute. So the original idea behind the EPA is a good one because Congress is not made up entirely of scientists, right? It's mostly lawyers, and lawyers aren't environmental scientists, and so you're going to need the testimony of environmental scientists. You're going to need someone to actually go out and do the research, find the samples, and prove perhaps that some company is putting too much mercury or some sort of toxin into the environment. You're going to need science for that.
To specifically not be political, though.
Right, not be political, right, and not to be the enforcement arm, right? Because right now there are a bunch of unelected bureaucrats with assault rifles, right? You've got the I think the U.S. Department of Agriculture has submachine guns, right?
Is that right?
Yeah. So
what are they doing with
they're
them?
checking the cows, you know what I mean? But there's when it comes to the FDA, I actually think the FDA is an easier case to make for the case of abolishment, because even though people they think, oh my gosh, well, it's the things that we eat all the time. I'm like, yeah, actually, and if you haven't noticed, people are much more conscious about what they eat. Whenever, look at Yelp reviews, perfect example. Every time you go and eat somewhere, I go and eat somewhere, if I've never been there before, I check the Yelp review.
Yeah.
And if they're like, it's dirty, it's got cockroaches, terrible service, I don't go there. And that's a market mechanism, that's a regulation, right? It's a free market regulation that people use in order to determine whether or not they should eat somewhere. I mean, it doesn't take very long to figure out that some food source is bad. But the problem is that when anybody makes a mistake, which they do, even the government can't even stop some salmonella from getting out. It happens. Whenever somebody's child dies, then they say, well, one death is too many. Let's create an enormous government institution for the children, and we'll save all the kiddies. And if you don't do this, then you hate children and you want all the children to die. And that's why we have these institutions, because as a politician, it's so much easier to say, well, I'm for the children. I'm for checking children's food. And we don't want them putting poison in babies' milk, right? Because people really have an incentive to poison babies' milk, right? Because actually, if you are a good producer of food and you create clean, healthy food, you make more money.
You make more money.
Yeah, Whole Foods, they're making much more than the lower end retail chains. So
I just walk in there and hand them all my cash, because I'm like, I know I'm not walking out of here with any money.
Well,
so.
in some sense it's elitism, because what they'll do is, like, the people who argue for it will say, oh, well, I'm not worried about me, right? It's not me. I'm wealthy enough to check my food. Like, I have no problem with it. Like, if I had a private agency that was checking the food and had a stamp on it, like, I would be fine. But it's all the underclass, right? It's the plebes that we need someone to take care of them, right? And it becomes a very elitist thing that we need to have the government, because we need to have the really, really smart people, like about 100 or 200 to 300 of them sitting in a room making these decisions for the plebes, and that's what it comes down to. It's very paternalist.
I never thought of it in the Whole Foods concept, but there is something really there, because if you go to Whole Foods, at least the one over here, they've got 5 levels of how they treat the animal, and one the lowest is like free range, which is still pretty damn good. The highest, it's like they took them out to dinner before and they drugged them and whatever. That sounded weird, but the point is that that's all done by Whole Foods.
Right.
It's by their policies.
Right. But if they don't do it at Walmart, you see and then the paternalist kicks in. It's like, but they don't do that at Walmart. Well, you don't shop at Walmart. Well, but other people do, and I care about them. No, you don't. You don't care about them. You're not charitable because you go and you take a gun and you put it to somebody's head and you say, you will make sure this food is clean.
But is there any evidence of a place where that was scaled? Like, before the FDA existed, were there a lot of stores that were I don't think people are intentionally poisoning tomatoes, if you're a little grocer.
Right.
But is there any evidence that it actually accomplished anything?
Yeah, the thing is that it's all about the incentives, right? So the question is do you think that people are incentivized to actually do good by their community? Because the way the capitalism works is the better you serve your community, the more money you make. Yeah. Right. But yeah, there's always examples of just like there have been financial panics before the Federal Reserve, but somehow instead of having great depressions like we did post-Fed, we have these little short-term blips, little panics that happen in a year. It cleans itself out and it's gone. But now what we do is government steps in and it prolongs crises, right? Or it exacerbates crises, because then you have to have taxpayer money spent on the cleanup, right? Whereas before, if there was like a food poisoning case, right, a local judge would have a judgment and they would exact tribute, and they would bring it back to whatever the victims were, and there would be just compensation for that. But again, it comes down to the question of whether or not you think that some bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. can centrally plan all of the food and all of the drugs
Right.
that everybody takes in the United States. I think it's hubris to assume that people are smart, right? And yeah, you can get the best people in the world, you know, and put them in a little room, and hopefully you're going to get some good ideas. But more often than not, it's hubris because they think that they can possibly plan all of our lives. They can't.
Yeah.
The definition of socialism is central planning, right? Central control over our lives, right? 90% income tax rate, you have no choice. The state plans everything. And that's really the road to serfdom, essentially, right? Freedom is dangerous. Freedom is dangerous as hell.
Yeah.
But I'll take
We're
it
going to start poisoning our tomatoes.
Right,
And by the way, you know, with all this inspector stuff, of course, first off, you can pay off an inspector very easily.
Sure.
There's so many little ways around it. It reminds me a little bit when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And I went to sleepaway camp, and the camp would be like a disaster for 3 weeks, and we were like swimming in sewage. The day before visiting day, when the parents are coming, they clean up the whole freaking place.
Yeah.
And it looks good. Parents come, they're happy, and then they leave. Next thing you know, next day we have lice and we're all this other stuff.
Right, but the difference between a private inspector and a state inspector is that if both have a tendency to be corrupt, but you can't fire the state inspector, right? It's going to take an election, or it's going to take, you know, some connections in D.C., right? But if you've got a private inspector, then they are much more tied to their communities, and again, you can fire them, you can prosecute them, and the government will guarantee is going to step in and clamp down on them. But if it's the government and you're trying to sue the state, it's very difficult.